Welcome everybody to this seminar. This is the second seminar in a series of 6 where we address China as a development actor in Africa. Today we are going to talk about China as a creditor, lending money to African states. There is now a situation where 30 countries in Africa have an emerging debt crisis. Between 4 and 5 of these countries are in an immediate problem of paying back their loans. They can't do it. And of course, this situation has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. This is an economic crisis for Africa, maybe more than a health crisis. And many countries have now got into negotiations about whether to pay back their loans. China has become a major creditor in Africa and now has become almost as large or maybe as large as the World Bank as a lender to African states. And we are going to talk about this today in 3 different countries. And I'm lucky to have with me 2 colleagues who have in-depth knowledge about the situation in these countries. And what we would like to understand is how China is as a creditor. How does it react to this emerging crisis of paying back the loans? And what is the relationship between China and the traditional donors, the Western donors, the World Bank, the IMF, the G20? And this is the part of a larger picture where China is emerging as a major actor on the African continent, both in aid in development and in investment. So with me today, I have Aslak Orre, who is a colleague at the Christian Michelsen Institute. He has been working on the issues of local government reform, corruption, and opposition in Africa, in particular the Lusophone countries, Mozambique and Angola. And he has done also a recent study on the debt crisis in Mozambique in particular. And then I have Arve Ofstad, who is also a former CMI colleague. He has been an ambassador to Zambia as his most recent post. He's now involved in many of the issues we're going to talk today through being a member of the management board of the African Legal Support Facility. And he is providing legal advice to this organization who is hosted by the African Development Bank. So if we look at the situation of the debt crisis in Africa, we see that this is not created by the COVID crisis, of course, but it's exacerbated by it. And there have been a huge increase in debts for how many years, I'm not sure, but for a longer period of time. This is not new. And then we would like to address the specific situation in 3 countries, and that is Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia. I will give the word to Aslak first, who's going to talk about the Angola's debt crisis and China's lending to Angola.
Yes, thank you very much for this nice introduction. I'm glad to be here with the 2 of you. And I think that the obvious reason for starting with the Angolan case is that Angola is by far the country in Africa to which China has lent most money. Before returning to that, and in order to contextualize China's China's lending to Angola, I wanted to start by explaining exactly how much of a pickle Angola really is in at the moment. And in order to do the to illustrate that, we need to wind back some 20 years, back to 2002, when Angola came out of a long and devastating civil war, which had destroyed most of the country's infrastructure. And Angola at that point had huge needs in terms of financing and reconstructing its infrastructure. So if we just move then 3 years ahead, or to about around 2005, everything suddenly looked much brighter for Angola. Angola had rapidly becoming a major oil producer, and the oil prices were soaring from a historical low around 1999 to, by the end of the 2000s, some over $100 per barrel. So that's when the point at which China enters Angola. China had a willingness and ability to finance the Angolan elite's enormous appetite for borrowing in order to finance the reconstruction of the country, where Western donors and financiers were not nearly as willing to do it. So this is what results in a boom in borrowing for financing infrastructure. And by 2007, Angola's GDP was growing almost, some say almost at 20% per year. So this was definitely the period between 2005 and 2008, around there, was definitely Angola's mini golden age, as my colleague Alves da Rocha once said. But if we wind up then today, Angola is in a terrible situation. It has now been in de facto recession for 5 consecutive years. Oil production, which is the mainstay of Angola's economy, is down from 1.8 million barrels per day in 2014 to 40% down to 1.1 by early 2021, which is now. So it has been running a high fiscal deficit for years. Angola is still completely oil dependent, with 96% of exports coming from oil. And the most dramatic figure is that Angola's current debt is at 130% of its GDP, which is absolutely unsustainable. Angola set aside in 2020, or for its 2021 budget, more than half of its national budget to debt servicing. This means that it's really unsustainable at the moment. So what we could say that after 12 years of an oil boom, Angola had failed to create sustainable development and instead entered a period of debt crisis. Now, what's the role of Angola's debt to China? Angola has, according to CARI, 256 loans from Chinese sources, amounting to a total of $43 billion. China is the biggest creditor of all categories to Angola. Angola's borrowing to China has become almost legendary in some circles and the object of fascinations of critics and admirers of China alike. And there are many myths around this, and such as Angola has been, or China is colonizing Angola, and people would think that, particularly in times where some 250,000 Chinese people were in Angola and working there by 2014. Other myths were like China is grabbing Angola's resources, China is creating infrastructure as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and China is massively invested in Angola. But most of these myths can be debunked if we look at just a sober analysis of what we see on the ground. So the loans from China ostensibly financed Angola's infrastructure in a series of infrastructure for oil deals, starting in about 2002 and lasting until 2016. That means China's loans, they financed Chinese companies coming to Angola and building the infrastructure carrying everything they needed for it, basically from China, workers and products, etc. Roads, bridges, airports, ports, hospitals, football stadiums, public buildings and private buildings, and more than anything, railroads, some 2,000 kilometers of rehabilitated railroads by Chinese companies. But there was actually very, very little investment on China's part. Most of the Chinese people in Angola have now left the country. Last point, China's lending to Angola has been notoriously non-transparent and associated with corruptions, as I think now everybody has heard about. For instance, many of the loans were channeled through the non-transparent systems of the National Office of Reconstruction, very closely linked to José Eduardo dos Santos' presidential offices and the China International Fund conglomerate. Everyone in Angola, kind of knows that, or reckons, even the current president reckons that that billions of dollars were somehow siphoned off through the corruption and kickbacks associated with this massive infrastructure development, and that they were siphoned or led into foreign bank accounts. If we look back on this infrastructure building, I would say that by and large, Angola got very low value for money for all of these loans. Much of the infrastructure has been of low quality and is now rapidly deteriorating or falling apart. And also the use value of much of this infrastructure is doubtful, such as the very, very expensive football stadiums and many other examples. So one can say that has Angola invested a lot? Now, has China invested a lot in Angola? No, not really. China is not, except for oil, a really big trading partner. Only 13% of Angola's imports comes from China. But by contrast, and this is the last figure I'm going to present, 70% of Angola's oil exports now goes to China. And we don't really know how much of that will eventually help ease the fiscal situation of Angola, because it's definitely part of the payback deal that Angola got for its loans to China. Yeah.
Quite a daunting picture of the Angolan situation. I think it would be interesting also to hear the experience from Zambia. Angola is an oil-producing country. Zambia has other raw material, which is of course interesting for China. That's probably a part of the picture. Let us hear from you, Arve, and about the situation in Zambia.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'd start by saying, it's interesting to hear the story from Angola, because the neighboring Zambia they're neighbors, but they're quite different. There are some similarities, as you indicated, but really they are two very different countries. Zambia is a smaller country. It's been peaceful throughout this period. And economically, they're just past the threshold of being a middle-income country, a lower-income, middle-income country. The GDP per capita compared to Angola is half or less than half. So it's poor from that point of view, but it's 3 times as big as Mozambique, which we're going to talk about. So the difference between the 3 is quite noticeable. So Zambia is in very many ways a kind of in-between country. It's not the poorest, it's not the richest, it's not the most autocratic, it's not the most democratic. It's kind of in between practically all indicators of development that you have. So that's the starting point. They are, as you said, heavily dependent for the exports on copper. We don't know for sure, but there are indicators that maybe half of it goes to China. in statistics, this is quite confusing because according to statistics, practically all of it goes to Switzerland. But Switzerland is only an office for a trading office. And for some reason, I haven't been able to find out. They still sort of record it as being sold to Switzerland, even though everybody who knows the story knows that practically half of it or maybe more goes to China. Copper is really important for Zambia. It accounts for still some 70% of its export incomes. And the ups and downs of the copper prices means a whole lot to the economy. It boomed from year 2000 and up to 2010-11, and then it stagnated. The prices fell again, and just this year or last year it started to go up again. So it's one of those issues that, and despite the period of good incomes, they haven't been able to differentiate the economy any better, unfortunately. Agriculture is the only one which is the only part which is actually doing okay. So the copper-dependent Zambia borrowed heavily in the previous periods from 1970 to 1990. They went into a first debt crisis. Yes, the price was falling, but the whole economy was also not managed well. So that even production of copper went down to less than half. The only answer to that period was borrowing. And this is in the 1970s, as some people may remember, was a period of the first oil price increase, and Zambia at the time was importing oil, and prices of many other things were falling. So there was a lot of oil-related money around, and Zambia was borrowing that, and it was generally seen as a country which could borrow. So up until the end of the 90s, it then, however, benefited from the previous debt relief campaigns, and through the what we call heavily indebted poor country debt relief program organized through the IMF and the World Bank, but with the support of other donors, it actually had practically all of its debt cancelled. So by 2005, it was practically zero. And for the next 5 years or so, during the good copper boom period, it borrowed only moderately. So it seemed to go very well for 5 years or so. And Zambia was also looked upon as one of the 10 countries in Africa which was growing fastest. Not quite as Angola, but still, it was doing seemingly well on that account. Until around 2010, 11, 12, prices peaked, and then the borrowing started again. So the new government, which came into power in 2011, was very ambitious in terms of its development programs. They had a president who believed that development is equal to road building, I think. So they wanted to build roads in every corner and every district and every region. And by that time, China started to become the most prominent lender. Also, we can go into this one. Another reason was because Zambia then had passed into this group of not the poorest, but the middle-income countries. And that means that you can't borrow as cheaply from the World Bank and the African Development Bank anymore. You have to sort of mix it with somewhat more expensive loans. So compared to that, China turned out to be the cheapest lender, actually. And in addition to the fact that they make rapid decisions, and were willing to borrow, to lend to purposes, as described by Aslak just now, that were not necessarily economically sustainable. So it took only 5-6 years until the borrowing started to reach a level of concern again. And this is not only the concern of outsiders, but even the opposition inside Zambia, the economists in Zambia started to get worried. And so the new crisis was emerging from 2016, 17, and it was declared high risk of unsustainable debt already by 18, 19. We can discuss what the purposes of this lending was, but as I said, a major part went to road building. Another major part was for power plants, power generation. And that means mostly hydroelectric, because there are opportunities for that in Zambia, but also an oil refinery. But in addition to building the power plants, it's also transmission lines. So China was lending for transmission lines. And then in addition, some of the, what shall I say, more gift-oriented aid project and, visible ones, such as the government building, 2 major stadiums also there, and some health purposes, and actually some military and police housing facilities. Most of these projects have not yet been generating much money. The major power plant which is being constructed is probably going to come online next year, and then it'll start generate funds as well. But until now, very little. What else about Zambia and debt? Now it became famous or infamous last year when it didn't pay its dues and defaulted, not on the Chinese loans, not on the World Bank, African Bank, but on the private loans which it had also borrowed from. So major private bankers in Europe called Eurobond, $3 billion, which are due to be paid back next year and the next few years. Even the interest rates they didn't pay last year. And that's related to the general appeal for debt relief, or at least debt service suspension, which we may talk about again later. As part of that, Zambia asked the private investors for a similar suspension of debt service, and it was refused by the lenders. And from what I gather, it may still not have been paid. And the reason is, we can go back to it, it's part of the whole international system of debt service suspension. I said that it was already debt distress before before 2020, before the COVID-19 hit us all. And as Lovise was saying initially, I think the major issue in Zambia because of the COVID is not the health crisis. I mean, it's a crisis for some people, but it doesn't cost that much. They don't really spend that much on the health situation. But because the general economy was deteriorated initially in the copper, but also the tourist sector, which is there, lost out. So this is true, but the point is, again, a little bit similar to the situation in Angola. The crisis was there already. It was already practically close to default. And again, it is related to some of the same issues. The borrowing which was made was not really made into economically sustainable programs in the short run. Maybe in the longer run, but not in the short run. Some of the investments will not pay back at all. And the general attitude towards economic policy has been not so wise. There are issues of corruption, suspected corruption also in Zambia, not as heavy as some other countries, but still an issue. And it's the general issue of mismanagement or poor management of the economy was there, obviously. And I'm saying that, and again, not saying it because I'm an outsider or because I say to what we always say about such countries, but also internally there's been this quite strong criticism of government policies. We can discuss why they have misused this money so far in the terms of ambitious development planning and some purposes of the elite. So I think that's what we shall say initially. The Chinese, also in Zambia, China has become the biggest bilateral donor. The figures are a bit uncertain. I think they have borrowed and actually been paid on some 3-4 billion so far. But their commitments to ongoing projects means that they have committed something like close to $9 billion US dollars, and that's a lot for the small economy of Zambia. And during this last year, which we'll return to, Zambia has actually benefited from the debt relief suspension from the other G20 countries, but also, which they have not borrowed so much actually, but also from China.
Yeah, so there are probably many issues that we are raising now that we're going to return to, but it's time to move to the third country, which is Mozambique. And I think that country is probably the country we are touching upon today, which has been affected mostly by debates on corruption, I think, probably, or at least what you have been looking at related to not only China, but other creditors as well.
Yeah, you're right about that. Although I presume that Angola will be a famous competitor for with Mozambique for the prize of famous corruption cases. But that aside, and I shall return to the issue of the relationship between the debt and corruption, which is a major thing in Mozambique as well. I first wanted just to comment that much as in Angola and also in Zambia, it's quite obvious that the COVID, the difficulties associated with the COVID crisis, not so much the health crisis, but the economic consequences of the global lockdown situation and reduction of trade has really exacerbated the problems in Mozambique. But it's also very clear that these problems are coming from way before the onset of the pandemic. And the troubles would have been there in any case. So Mozambique is now actually, like in Zambia, in a situation of real sovereign debt default. It's been that for some years. And that situation didn't, as I said, it didn't start with COVID. So let's take a brief look at the Mozambican situation in order to contextualize the Chinese the debt to China. Then, if we wind back to 1992, Mozambique was coming out of a long post-independence civil war, which, like in Angola, was also very, very destructive, and both in infrastructure terms and human development. Mozambique was definitely at the time in the 90s among the poorest countries in the world, and a very low level of economic activity. Then, by the 2000s, the debt was pardoned under the HIPC initiative, highly indebted poor countries initiatives, so that much like in Zambia, Mozambique had an insignificant debt level by 2005. And just at that time, that's when Mozambique also entered upon a period of a boom, economic boom, and high economic growth, spurred by new findings and new activities in the extractive industries. Coal and natural gas, insignificant, and a myriad of other extractive industries. So this lasts and creates quite a bit of optimism, and Mozambique gets portrayed in many international instances as the coming star of Africa, and they were doing everything as they were supposed to under the donor donor regimes, or the post-Washington consensus conditionalities for receiving a lot of international development assistance. But by 2010, the renewed optimistic outlook of growth in Mozambique created also a boom of massive borrowing, which then turned into higher debt levels, which by now have turned unsustainable. Part of that, or some 20% of that debt, stems from illicit borrowing, or what in Mozambique has become known as the hidden debt scandal. Debts they took up in public companies back in 2013, and it only came to the light of day by 2016 how large these debts were, and apparently some $2 billion just have really been borrowed and vanished, but Mozambique is left with the debt. So, the reason why I'm connecting this debt to the boom in the extractive industries is that, in a way, this could be captured as a sort of a resource curse, as part of the resource curse where massive borrowing came on top of the extractive industries boom. Then I would also use the term pre-source curse, which I think more and more academics are now becoming familiar with, where you add a P before the resource curse, indicating that all the effects of the curse come before the resources have actually been extracted. And what happens is that Mozambique finds natural gas in the sea offshore Mozambique in enormous quantities. Or actually, Mozambique didn't find it, it was international petroleum companies who found it. And all of a sudden, it looks as if Mozambique is rich. And on basis of the expected enormous increase in income, in national income, they figure out, or someone in the Mozambican figures out, that we can start borrowing on the basis of our expected income in the future. So in comes China, and it turns out that from having almost no lending to Mozambique, insignificant lending by 2010, by 2016-17, China had become Mozambique's biggest lender. Now back to the current debt crisis. Mozambique's debt to GDP is now more than 100%, also considered by economists as absolutely unsustainable. It's been in default, and this is the current context. So if you look at more onto the Chinese debt that comes from 2010 and onwards, Overall debt to China stands at, the overall debt of Mozambique stands at $12 billion. The external debt is $10 billion. And of that, China's part is 20%, that is about around $2 billion, making China the biggest bilateral donor, the biggest bilateral creditor. That's important. By comparison, in order to say this is not all China's debt. So Mozambique owes about $4 billion in debt to the multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank and to the IMF. But on top of this, on top of these $12.4 billion comes somewhere in between $2 and $4 billion related to the hidden debt scandal. This may be why in some instances, such as the IMF and the World Bank estimates Mozambique's real debt to something like $18 billion and not only 12. The debt to China is almost all to the Export-Import Bank, or known as the Exim Bank. And almost all of it went to finance roads and bridges, as well as several airports. The Maputo Airport, also the National Stadium, football stadium in Maputo, and several, at least one regional airport. Also, some important bridges, like the Armando Guebuza Bridge over the Zambezi River, named after the previous president of Mozambique. So let me just say a few words about servicing the debt to China. There is now little transparency about the terms of the loans that China gave to Mozambique. The finance minister, Adriano Maliane, he stated that the debt to China would pay itself, for instance, due to the application of toll roads. One of these toll road systems is linked to China's or Chinese companies' building of the circular road around Maputo, the capital, which is now a toll road. Another toll road is the bridge across the Maputo Bay that was built to the value of some $720 million, only that. So it eats up a large chunk of Mozambique's debt to China. And supposedly, and as everybody in Maputo knows, the bridge over the Maputo Bay sort of goes to nowhere. There's not a lot of people on the other side. And it's very doubtful, really, if those toll roads across the bridge can really finance a $720 million bridge anywhere near the future, because so few are actually using that bridge. And by way of personal anecdotes, I can recall that once, a couple of years ago, we were driving on that road, and the toll road that was supposedly set up to pay for the road, we actually just passed it by going on the gravel outside of the toll post, like most other cars, like all other cars did. So again, there's a history of some, the question of if Mozambique got real value for money from the loans from China, and also the question if there was a lot of corruption involved and overpricing of these products because of corruption. And there's really a question if they are good development, or if good development has come out of it.
So there seems to be quite similar questions across the three countries about the value of development of these loans. But Arve, if you look at 3 countries and maybe also at the larger African picture, what would you say then is the similarity in China's approach to these countries, and maybe also the differences, if there are major differences, and what are the patterns here across the cases, and maybe also with reference to the larger African picture?
Well, to help the level of confusion, I think it is as important to look at the differences first. Yes, we've heard of 3 different countries. There are similarities of the issues involved, but they're really different. And the African leaders and the African spokespersons always underline the fact that there are the 51 different countries in Africa. So sometimes the outsiders seem to talk about Africa as one country, and it definitely isn't. A huge differences. So we see that in this case. We see the differences in size, in the economic level, in the economic opportunities that they have. We also see that the level of debt is very, very variable. There are some countries that hardly have any debt, and there are these countries that are in close to heavy debt, and there are some medium-sized countries. And there are big differences in terms of how much they have been borrowing from China and from others. As we've been saying, traditional lenders are often the multilaterals. The World Bank and the African Bank is a prime source of lending. The other donors have mostly been donors and not also providing grants, gifts, not to be repaid. But in the last 10, 15 years or so, new lenders have also come on scene, which we've heard a little bit about now, but I think it's important to remember that, because you hear about China, and at the overall picture, China represents maybe as much as 20% of the total debt in African countries, which means 80% is others.
Yeah.
And it used to be maybe 50% were the multilaterals, but then who are the others? Yes, many of the Arab banks have come in many of the countries. And increasingly, many countries have been borrowing at the private market. So the debt is really more mixed than it used to be in the old days. And getting the private lenders and the Arab lenders on board in terms of debt reliefs and debt service suspension is more difficult than it was during the previous crisis of the HIPC period.
Yeah.
So this is.
Can I just add in that another important lender in, for instance, the 2 Lusophone countries, Angola and Mozambique, has been Brazil, which is also important, I believe also in South Africa, where Brazilian companies have been active and more or less going into the same type of agreements. The Brazilian Development Bank has financed Brazilian companies coming to these countries and building infrastructure, and leaving infrastructure and leaving the debt as well.
Yeah.
But then I wanted to ask, because you have mentioned the Export-Import Bank, and then there is another, the China Development Bank. What are these institutions, and what are their relationships with the Chinese authorities? For those who are not really so knowledgeable about this, it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about these institutions.
Yes, and even to add to that, China has also been provided some grants, some aid programs, and some lending at 0 rate or practically 0 rate. These are the ones that we've sometimes talked about as the visible sports stadium, for instance, and government buildings. They've often been given on very, very low rates and practically loans. And as we'll see also later, these are the loans that have more often been cancelled or terminated altogether during relief operations. So there is an element of that, but they are, I think, somebody say maybe 5% or so of the total lending from China. Then comes the Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank, it's called. And that is a totally state-owned bank. And they are the ones that they are the biggest actors in Africa, from what I can see. And they do provide the lending to many of these projects where there are Chinese, or most often they're linked to Chinese companies undertaking the projects, which means that they're tied loans, which is something which we've been discussing before. And it happens from other donors too, but China has been very strong on tying these programs, these credits, loans to Chinese companies. Now, I don't really, the second largest one is the China Development Bank, as you said. And it's also a state-owned bank. Sometimes the Chinese seem to sort of make a distinction between the two, saying that the Chinese Development Bank is more of a commercial actor than the Exim Bank. But I don't know enough about it, but I don't really see the big deal because they're actually lending to very similar programs and projects. The next thing to say is, as Aslak was just saying now, the terms of lending are often not publicly available, easily available. I've seen some, so it's not totally secret, but it's difficult to get the full picture of the terms of these. Those I've seen, and I think even Zambia published its general rates on all its foreign loans, and it turned out to be that the only borrowing that they had undertaken for more than 5% interest rates were from private banks. Everything else was less. Yeah. And the average seems more often to be maybe 2 or 3% per year. It varies from the Chinese banks, but that maybe up to 4 or 5%. It varies. But it also has a grant element in that you don't have to repay, sometimes for 5 years, sometimes for 10 years. There's a grace period. And the final thing is that there is a fairly long period to pay it back eventually, 20 years or maybe even more. So, but it varies, and therefore, and it's not often not very visible, so it's difficult for us to see. So these are the main ones, and then in addition comes, more specialized banks in the industrial field, in the mining field, in the aviation field, I've seen, and then also provinces in China are starting to lend. Not so much to Africa, I haven't seen it often there, but they have become active on the scene as well. So it's a complicated picture also from the Chinese side.
But this prompts a question of the motives behind this kind of activities in Africa. What are the main motives for China to lend so much money to African states? Is it to promote development?
Rule the world?
To rule the world? Yeah, I mean, that's a common conspiracy these days. I think John Bolton, the famous John Bolton, has called China's policy debt trap diplomacy, and using debt as a way of promoting its own role, and also politically. Is China the new imperialist and using debt as a way of getting that position? Or what do you think?
Should I answer that?
Yes, please.
Based on the experiences from the countries I know best, I think there are, we've been considering this sort of these hypotheses or theories or even popular expectations or popular assumptions about the role of China, and also I would say a considerable degree of popular suspicion towards the Chinese activities, perhaps even more so than other creditors, for reasons I wouldn't go into now. But I think that looking back on, for instance, China's borrowing to extensive lending to Angola, it looks like an entirely commercial relationship, really, where China was able to finance its own companies to go out, was part of the going out policy of China, which I think was, it looks like as if it was motivated by stimulating Chinese economy and, you know, doing something about the enormous financial capacity that the country was developing, and sending the companies out and saying, go out there, get some experience, create jobs, create profits, and we'll finance the activities. And Angola is in a good position to pay back the debt or the finance of this, because it's got so much oil. And what happens, I think part of the proof of that situation, or the if you look at what has happened after the economic downturn in Angola, is that most of the Chinese companies have left. There are quite a few still in the country, but not anywhere near so many as there were in 2015 or 2014. Basically, when there are no more economic opportunities, they just leave. And there is really no one to take care of the maintenance of all the infrastructure that has built it. Another sign that it was just a commercial relationship from the beginning. I mean, if you had expected that this was really to be part of the Belt and Road initiatives and so on, you would have expected them to invest more in staying and really taking care of this infrastructure in the long haul. But that's not what it looks like to me.
That again also is prompting us to ask, why would African countries be interested in taking loans from China? What would you think would be the main motive behind? You have touched upon it, the terms, maybe they are better and cheaper than elsewhere. What would you think is the main reason for this extensive borrowing from China from the African side?
No, I think we've been saying something about it, that it's become available. It wasn't before 2005 or so, and hardly before 2010. They were starting, but since then they have become available and they are being offered. And as I said, particularly for the not so poor countries, not the poorest countries, it's at a reasonable rate. And thirdly, they come. People say they come without strings, which is not completely true. But they sometimes become much easier to negotiate. There's a lot of complaints about the World Bank, which is requiring so many pre-studies and again pre-studies, and everything else has to be really negotiated. So it takes a long time to make a decision. Same thing with the European Union. It's being said, when the Chinese decide to fund something, they do it almost like that. So it's easy contract to enter into without too many considerations at that up until now. I think definitely even the Chinese lenders have become more careful in recent years. There are signs that they don't necessarily go into a project, partly because of what Aslak was saying, that they're not so easily getting their money back at all, and they've been under stronger things. But so then there are rumors that there are kickbacks for the decision makers, and certainly also in Zambia that's been the case in the road sector, and it's quite it was quite sort of telling that the decision making regarding loans particularly from China was not negotiated so much by the Ministry of Finance but by the office of the president.
Mhm.
So it became a centralized thing, and many were saying that the office of the president is the one which is sort of negotiating these things and not paying attention to the warnings, not even from their own Ministry of Finance or from their own central bank. Now, why do they do that? Well, partly because of the political implications. And as I said, road building is a sign that, government is doing something and they want to, and it's a vote getting. And maybe some people inside where we're getting some kickbacks from the contracts. I heard the previous vice president of Zambia also saying that we know, but the loans are so cheap that it pays to ask the Chinese contractors to do so, even if they overcharge us. Even if they are overcharging, it makes sense for us to do so. And we think that they are overcharging, but because the actual road building is more expensive than if they had been out on the open market, but it still makes sense because they're getting it for at a reasonable credit. They only have to pay it back in 10 years from now, and then I'm no longer a vice president.
Mhm.
We're pushing things into the future, unfortunately. So there are these elements into the situation.
Would you say that this is the same for Angola and Mozambique, about the motives behind and seeing China as an attractive creditor?
Yeah, so I think we don't really know the terms of the loans. So it's hard to evaluate the sort of in a direct comparison between the Chinese loans and any other commercial loan or say a concessional loan from the World Bank or some of the other or bilateral development agencies. But one should also take into account two things when counting in the costs of or evaluating the costs of the Chinese loans. One is the question of value for money. How much do these countries get back for the loans in terms of infrastructure or other things that have lasting value? Now, even if the interest rates or the terms of payback and so on are favorable in a direct comparison, they may be real costs of these loans may be really high if one compares it to what is actually left. For instance, when paying for bridges if they fall, if they're poorly constructed, and they fall apart after 5 or 10 years. So that is one question. I think that part of the motive is to do something quickly, as you said, to be able to have something to show for, which is good for vote gathering. But in the case of Angola in particular, it's absolutely obvious by now that the Chinese loans were part of massive subsidizing of the Angolan ruling elites' enrichment during these years. And it's quite obvious that the money were spent on Chinese infrastructure projects. Companies of China were building stuff, but the local subcontractors, if they needed sand, who would get the contracts for delivering the sand? Well, that would be some Angolan general belonging to the ruling party and his company, delivering bits and pieces of the contract, and for very favorable terms. And so under this heading comes a lot of corruption and kickbacks. That makes the intransparency of the Chinese deals makes this so attractive to these elites, at least in the countries I know.
Yeah, I only partly agree.
Okay.
There are elements of that, as I said myself, but I've also, it's also very visible that some of these infrastructure projects definitely in the longer term makes sense. And that without this, the country would have been worse off. So, and as I'm saying, some of the projects are not yet online. They're also constructing new airports in 2 airports in Zambia, and one of them again, which is probably going to become open next year, and the other one next year after in the important middle of the copper belt. And in the longer term, it makes sense. In the shorter term, it may be costly, but even in terms of some cases are known, and you can calculate it probably. Even there is value in some of these projects, definitely, and there's value in some of the roads that is being built. Even though there is an issue, I can give you a small story, because when I came to Zambia the first time, in 2011, there had just been there were elections just immediately afterwards, and the new president Sata called me in almost immediately before I was really properly inaugurated, and said, you're from Norway, I need to build roads, and you have to tell me which is the Norwegian company which built this road. And he mentioned one road between 2 places. I was so new, I hardly knew which road they were talking about, because you build it, that's a lasting road, because we don't want the Chinese, because that's falling apart. That's what he said, because it's breaking up. But this Norwegian road, it's known as the Norad Road or something, it was built. So I went home, I went back to the embassy and asked, where the Norwegians built this road. And unfortunately it turned out to be a Danish project and constructed by Danish and Finnish companies. But it's an illustration in a way of the issues of quality. And several of the main roads that are being constructed also by the Chinese in Zambia are not much used. They are, but if you're talking about the development of the countryside, development of the various regions, you need good roads. So maybe not the first year and maybe not the first 10 years, but eventually these roads are needed. And there are other cases where I've seen that, the one road was part of the road funded by the Asian Development Bank, and the next level was funded by the Chinese, and they all went together actually. And definitely I'm convinced that the power stations and the grids and the electricity grid is going to make sense again. Because the major power plants which are now being constructed was open for discussions and open for even an open tendering. And eventually, and again, when I came, there had been a previous offer from the Chinese to fund it and construct it and everything, and the new government sought to untie it, to put it, make funding one part and make the construction another part, etc. So it all, so there are elements of where you can feel certain that this is actually makes sense economically as well. So I'm partly agreeing. I think there are cases where they've not made good use of the money and where things have been overpriced and things have been done because of kickbacks. But there are other cases definitely that are good for the long-term development.
Yeah.
So
can I just hasten to add that I would like to qualify what I previously said, in the sense that yes, there are also examples of obviously good projects that have been financed by Chinese loans. And also, in terms of the bad projects, China is definitely not alone in financing that.
So that means that the picture is mixed when it comes to the sort of development outcome of this funding or of this financing and the loans. As
Aslak says, as it is for other development programs, whether it's funded by Norway or World Bank or others. Some are doing very good, some are okay, and some have not made.
But that mixed picture does not really undermine the kind of caution and the situation where these countries are, as Phil is saying in the chat, reaching an unsustainable level of debt, and what is happening when this situation, if this situation is worsening and continues, he's asking. Even if it has good development outcomes, finally, there is a huge debt issue here. The problem of the question, of course, is why are the African leaders or the those in charge of this entering this kind of situation where they're coming into this major debt crisis?
Well, there are of course countries that don't.
Sure, of course. But the countries we are talking about today are, and there are many more.
Yeah. No. I don't have the answer actually easily, because my experience from Zambia is that there were plenty of warnings, and the opposition leader have been complaining, saying that there is going to be a way out. Zambia has been negotiating a kind of a package with the IMF for 4 years, and they still haven't been able to agree fully. And some critics would say that it's because the IMF is putting conditions in terms of cutting down on health and education, which is not true. This is not what they do. The IMF first, they had an issue with, similar to the Mozambique, that there might be hidden loans. And this is because some of the state-owned companies were borrowing without it registered properly with the authorities, and even though the government actually were guaranteeing for it, but that guarantee was sort of hidden in a way, or not clear. So there's been a lot of work in order to make sure that whatever the state-owned companies have been borrowing, which is guaranteed by the state, is being registered as state debt. So that's the first one. And then the second thing has been certainly, how do you handle the next ones? Do you continue borrowing? Can you postpone some of the commitments on the loan commitments, which has been done in Zambia, but not enough? I mean, they continue to borrow. You ask me why, and I don't really have the answer, because if you ask the Ministry of Finance, they say, we have a debt sustainability policy where we will postpone even commitments. We will try to sort of postpone them. So, and then we will make sure that the new ones do pay back, and we be more careful, etc., etc. But the political situation in between the country makes it difficult for them to yeah. There is another issue which maybe he's asking, will the Chinese, if they don't get the money back, will they take over ownership? This has been an issue. And we said several times already that the full terms of the loans are not always open and easily understood. But there were lots of rumors in Zambia that once the Chinese were lending for the power plant, which has been mentioned, as a collateral or as a kind of security, if they don't get the money back, they will take over the whole electricity company for the whole country. This was which was being stayed very strongly by many, and was reported in this Africa Confidential newsletter, which is often been read, which is not true. What they will do is definitely they will keep on control over that particular power plant. They will have part ownership. And it is a system which is called build, operate, and own for a while, and operate, and then transfer once it's paid back, which is a common thing for other investors. It's a common thing even in Norway, private is funding and they're keeping ownership until it's paid back. So it is not as sinister as it looks. And the same thing was being said. China was co-funding with the Zambia Broadcasting a digitalization of it. So they organized a sub-company. And the rumor said, you know, if they don't get that money back, they would take over the whole broadcasting corporation. Again, not true. But they would certainly hold on to that digital part of it until it would be paid back. So there is easy sort of made additional rumors about.
But that may not be so surprising because of the lack of transparency of the terms, as we talked about. How is that? Are there parallels in your countries, or do you have comments on what he already said here?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is also this fear or suspicion in the opposition and civil society, critical civil society organizations, and so on, that the Chinese, at the end of this, will somehow appropriate themselves of the valuables or the infrastructure of these countries. But there's absolutely no evidence of an overt and wholesale takeover of Chinese by the Chinese of African infrastructure, for instance. Or that's just not happening. And where is the evidence for that? On the other hand, and there's probably a more sinister side to this, although it is hard to prove. But what is currently going on in both Angola and Mozambique is that the opposition parties and the critical civil society organization accuse covert deals between Chinese companies and the local elites connected to the ruling parties of these countries, that as a way of making the Chinese more lenient towards the debt repayment of the nation by such, they are allowed instead not to have a full takeover of infrastructure, but rather to bring out the resources of the countries in bits and pieces, such as timber, valuable minerals and so on, illicit trade in ivory and exotic fauna and so on that are really expensive and selling for high prices in China, so that they're being brought out of the country without paying taxes and tolls and so on. So that is maybe one way by which, it's hard to say China, but somehow Chinese interests are bringing out resources that they would otherwise have not been able to if the African countries had been in a stronger position to withstand the pressure from Chinese creditors. But to think also that there will be no pressure from Chinese creditors to have their loans back, that would also be an illusion. Yeah.
But there is also one question in the chat here that is talking about whether there are any links or any connection between China's political ambitions and the loans, and whether that could, the loans and the kind of connections and relationships that creates through African state could be used as a political leverage, for example, in the UN or in other important contexts internationally. Whether you've seen any of these, or whether you think that's completely part of a conspiracy.
Well, I think China wants to make friends.
Yes.
And they want to convert that into the global level, as we do.
Yes.
I mean, how did we get so many votes in to become members of the Security Council?
We distributed waffles.
Oh, I see. No, but we also convert the high level of development aid, which is a political, power from our side, and you know, to make friends in the world, not only those that we give money to, but also those who, you know, show the good face about. So yes, there is an element of that. The story is interesting because there's one. China claims that they are not want to. They don't take it a condition to influence the internal politics of a country, which is a bit sort of an issue, because there's one issue which they definitely are concerned about, is whether that country is accepting Taiwan as a separate country. Yeah. If they do, they can forget about anything from China. So that's definitely one political condition that they make. Interestingly, though,
meaning there are currently no African countries except for one. I think
Malawi was one of the latest ones.
Swaziland, apparently.
Swaziland, okay. So yes, so that's one condition. It was interesting again when in Zambia, the Zambian ambassador there, after the elections stood out and sort of talked very nicely and warmly about the good democracy in Zambia. The fact that they changed a political party in leadership as a result of the elections, and he spoke warmly about it. And I think what we see is there's no Maoist sort of movement in African countries supported by the Chinese, you know, trying to to make these countries into you know, the political model. I don't see that anymore. But the fact that China is a powerful country, that it's been able to sort of grow well and reduce its poverty level to that extent, you know, is a model for many countries, regardless of whether you borrow from them or not. You know, you look at, you know, maybe that's something which we should do too. In addition to that, they have a party which has this total control of the political situation. So it looks like a good model, or a possible model, regardless. So that will be there, you know, irrespective of the lending, is my point. So I don't see the connection between the lending and the political influence in that respect.
No, I think also that there is no need for any conspiratorial analysis of this. Maybe a few isolated cases where that could have been the case, but most of, at least the countries I know that I've been talking about now, have been quite astute at balancing the big powers and the different creditors and the bilateral and multilateral donors up against each other. And they've been learning to do this through the entire post-independence time, because they've always had to finance the development with external funds. So China is now the latecomer in this game, but it's not really different. So they have to take into account China's desires politically and the China's want or attempt at buying friends through loans, if you so want. But in doing so, China is no different from all the other big powers. So they're just another player in the balance, I would say. There's the United States, there's Russia having influence more during the Cold War than now, but still Russia is in some of these countries a significant player. So is Turkey. The Arab countries have their interests, and so, you know, they carefully have to balance all these things, and just thinking that they would somehow play to the tune of China only because China is the biggest lender, no, that wouldn't happen.
And as we said, it's only 20% anyway.
Yeah.
And I agree fully with what Aslak just said. You know, it's obvious, and the whole tradition of the non-aligned movement, which we've forgot here, is alive in many African countries. you know, and I heard that very strongly also in Zambia. Yes, no, we like the Americans, we like the Europeans.
So the non-aligned movement is the one that, you know, maintaining independence and not
The
siding.
non-aligned movement was
Yeah.
established during the Cold War.
Yes.
By leaders, including Kaunda in Zambia, and Nehru in India, and others, to tell the world that we are not aligned, not with the West and not with the Soviet Union of the time. So we want to stay neutral, and that idea, I think, is still very much alive. Even though the movement itself as an organization is not so visible. Yeah.
But we are approaching the end of this seminar, but I would like to just talk a little bit more about the very recent economic crisis related to the pandemic, and also how China has related to an initiative from Western donors, the World Bank and the IMF and the G20 on a debt suspension initiative. It's not been completely clear how China has related to this. In the beginning, it seemed like they wanted to stay out of this, but then they've agreed to join this initiative. Or if you can give us some insights into this, and that could also throw some light on the role of China as a creditor in Africa in relating to the economic crisis from the pandemic.
There is a think tank in the States called the China-Africa Research Initiative, CARI, which has been tracking this very well. And I think it's very interesting. As you said, I think it was the World Bank and the IMF proposed to the G20 that there should be a debt service suspension early last year, as the COVID-19 started to be noticeable and having effects also in the developing world. And the G20, of which China is a member, that is the 20 biggest economies in the world, agreed that there should be a suspension, that is a postponement of payment of debt service, that is both interest rate as well as the main principle of the debt for at least half a year until the end of 2020. And this is more later in the last year, it was agreed that they should be postponed until mid of this year. So that is the agreement, general agreement of the G20, that they will ask, and it is affect the bilateral official debts. So they have agreed to that. It actually does not include the multilateral debts of the World Bank and the African Bank, but they're generally on sort of easier standards anyway. But so, and China has agreed to that, but it's not automatic. It's not automatic even for the other G20 countries. The countries have to ask for it. I think Rwanda is one country which hasn't even asked for it. So, and by now, I think some out of the 76 countries that are eligible, at least between 40 and 50 have actually requested some relief. And what does China do? Yes, they also agreed in principle that they would follow suit. But as we talked about earlier, there are various sort of elements of the China lending practices, and it seems definitely again that the cheapest loans, zero interest loans, they are easily being cancelled even. So China is following up on that. They even canceled for Botswana, which is not even an eligible country. They, have less than 100 million US dollars, so it was not big money. But that's what that happened. And secondly, they initially said that it was the loans from the Export-Import Bank that would come under this initiative and agreement. And initially, this China Development Bank was sort of excused and not to be good because they claimed that, you know, these loans are more commercial. But as it turned out, the first agreement with Zambia was actually to make a debt relief suspension of the loans from the China Development Bank. So that has been included. But thirdly, China says, you know, they will do it on a case-by-case basis, and that maybe even includes some of the other loans that they may have. So they're even less automatic if you want so. So they seem to be more careful. And next, also, there is poor coordination between them and the rest of the G20.
Yeah.
So that's an issue, you know. But it's a little bit better than during the hippie period or period where there was no connection. Now that China feels its obligation as part of the G20. So it's actually following up, but not, you know, 100% in a way. So, and the last thing I would say about this is that China is in this case, as they have been previously, they're very concerned that they don't want to be lenient, or they don't want to give any suspension or postponement or even debt relief unless others do the same thing. And that has been an issue when it comes to Zambia's lending from the private banks, I said initially. It seemed that it's pressure from China and others which made sure that Zambia defaulted on its private bank loans. Because I said, you know, China, they don't say explicitly China, but we have the feeling that China is at least one of them. Yeah. Says, you know, if you're paying back to them, you pay back us as well. You know, so that's been a sort of condition from the Chinese. So it's a little bit, yeah, it's almost there, but not quite. Should I say that?
Yeah. I think that this is one of the most interesting parts of the discussion that I don't have the full answer to, but I'm seeing that there are many arguments to believe that in relation to many of these African countries, the smaller ones in particular, China will start to act more or less like, or will align themselves to the discussions going on in the other G20 countries, simply for the reasons that if they want the money back, and if they at the same time want to maintain any friends there, they need to be to behave, and you know, they cannot be the most demanding creditor, nor can they be the most lenient, because that will also create some moral hazards that the Chinese are aware of. We've been discussing Angola, and I think that Angola comes in a particular category because it's in many ways not like many other African countries, simply because the Chinese, the Angolan debt to China is so large. And then it comes, so whereas, for instance, Mozambique's 2 billion debt to China, it's probably something like, not peanuts, but it's not that important to the Chinese, but accumulated with all these other smaller African debts, it's quite a big, significant chunk. But Angola alone has 43 billion in debt to dollars to China, and that is not insignificant money. And in a very similar situation on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean is another country very similar to Angola in terms of oil dependence, which is Venezuela, which owes $100 billion to China. And then we're starting to talk about sums that are not insignificant, and China really needs to relate to this in a sort of a geostrategic way, trying to decide who they really, how do they want to demand. Because with loaning so much money, I think also China has got itself in a bit of a pickle with these countries. And it's now going to have to behave like a big power some way or another. And that's going to be looking very interesting during the years to come, I think.
But now actually it's 10 o'clock, or it's 10 o'clock at least in Norway. And we have approached the end of the seminar. There are so many interesting discussions that we could have continued. Some of the discussions will continue next week with another seminar in this series. where we talk about China as an aid provider in Africa. Isn't that right? And then we will have the former director of NORAD, Jon Lomøy, who will be part of the panel, and Dan Bannick, who is a professor at the University of Oslo, and Erling Kjønneland, who is the project leader of a research project that we are involved in currently, where we look at China as a development actor in Africa. So stay tuned, and you can also find this debate, this webinar online later, I think, on YouTube, Bergen Global. So please have a look, and thank you for attending, and thank you for the questions.